another entry in my childhood favorite series. And today I'm reviewing a film that I have liked ever since I was a kid, and I've reviewed it once before on here, and that was mostly from memory, so before I reviewed it again, I decided to give it another watch. And I have to say the film still holds up. Now I will say it's not as good as the other two Disney films that were made within the decade or so of this film that combine live action with traditional animation. But it's still an entertaining film, and it still has that charm you expect whenever you hear the Disney music and see the castle emblem. It still has that charm. And of course the movie I'm talking about is the 1977 film directed by Don Chaffey and starring Helen Reddy, Jim Dale, Mickey Rooney, Red Buttons, Shelley Winters, and introducing Sean Marshall as one half of the title, technically. The film I'm talking about is, of course, Pete's Dragon. This is the VHS I've had ever since I was a kid, and this is how I mostly have watched this film. Now, to talk about this film, I'm going to first talk about how I came into contact with the film. Now, I first heard of this film when I was a little kid. It was one of those days, I don't remember the very specifics about it, but it was basically me and my grandmother going through this one warehouse store. We walked by the VHS tapes, and I happened to spot this VHS tape, and I'm like, hey, that's looking interesting, so she gets it for me, and I watched the crap out of it as a kid. And that's basically a long story short. Now, for the production of the film itself, it goes back to the 50s, when an unpublished short story by writer Seton I. Miller and his friend S.S. Field, Disney acquired the rights to the story with the intent of using it on their Disneyland anthology program. Instead, of course, it was eventually given a feature film treatment by Malcolm Marmorstein, and of course, it was his biggest undertaking to date. And of course, as I mentioned, it was directed by Don Chaffey, who had helmed the two smaller films for Disney in between larger fantasy films he did, like Jason and the Argonauts and 1,000,000 Years BC. And of course, in case you're wondering, the other films he did films like The Webster Boy, Nearly a Nasty Accident, and he did two films after this, The Magic of Lassie and Chomps. And of course, I've already mentioned probably the films that more people know him for anyway, but as a director, I'll say for this film he actually did a pretty good job. And the film was filmed, I know part of it was filmed in California in Morro Bay, it's a substitute for Maine. And here's something I did not know actually until I actually did research recently. But the animation for the film is done by the legendary Don Bluth. I think you all know he did films like An American Tail, Troll in Central Park, Anastasia. He did the animation for Dragon's Lair. Before this, for Disney, he did The Rescuers and The Fox and the Hound. Ironically, another film with Mickey Rooney. The Secret of Nim is probably another one of his well-known ones. Land Before Time, All Dogs Go to Heaven. So I should have been able to tell because it has kind of that distinct Bluth type style, but more so for his Disney days. And very good animation. And I will say, with the animation, if this film was made nowadays, it'd be CGI, but I don't think it would have as much of a Disney charm because there's just something about traditional drawn animation, even more so when you look at the films that combine it with live action. It just seems to have a charm that CGI will never be able to match. It's the difference in how they construct a traditionally drawn animated character compared to a CGI animated character. Now, I'm happy to report I'm not the only person that likes this movie. On IMDb it has a 6.1, and on Rotten Tomatoes it's a little lower. It's 59% with the audience and 50% with the critics, but I have to disagree with the consensus of the critics is. This is what the consensus is on Rotten. Consensus! I have trouble with that word. This is what the consensus is. Boring and slow, this is a lesser Disney work, though the animation isn't without its charm. I will disagree with the boring and slow part, because I never found myself being bored by this film, and I don't really think the film is slow, especially considering the different versions of the film. There's multiple, although it's kind of hard to find them on home video. There are multiple versions. The hardest one, of course, the one we're probably never going to see is the original one version that was shown when the film first premiered, but that's besides the point. The lesser Disney work, that is kind of debatable. I will say it's not as good as, let's say, Mary Poppins or Bedknobs and Broomsticks, but it is still, I will say, still a pretty good Disney film for what it is. And to use lesser as an insult, I think it's kind of stupid. I mean, do you expect all films like this to be as good as Mary Poppins? That's kind of like trying to always compete with yourself. It's like Metallica always trying to redo the Black Album with each successful work. Not going to work. Or Guns N' Roses trying to always do their first album over and over again. Not going to work. The animation has its charm, I will agree with that. Now, the plot of the film is it takes place in the early 20th century, although no specific year is given, but you can kind of tell around the time period just by the way that characters are dressed. After an introduction with music, an overture, we're introduced to our main character, a young orphan named Pete, who is fleeing from his abusive adoptive hillbilly family, the Gogans, with the aid of his trusty friend, a dragon named Elliott. Now, Elliott can become invisible, which is a plot point at several times, especially when we first see him, because we don't see Elliott for the first scene. And he's helping, Pete escape by flying. The Gogans appear, and we get the first musical number, which is one thing I forgot to mention. This film is a musical, and it actually does a pretty good job with the songs. There's technically 13 musical numbers, though 2 of them at the end are just brief ones, so I wouldn't really say they're big numbers. So not counting that, there's 10, because there's 13 on this list, but one of them is the main title, so I won't count that. So there's 10. There's Happiest Homes in This Hills, the I Love You Too song, I Saw a Dragon, which is one of my favorite numbers of the movie. It's Not Easy, Passamaquoddy, probably the song everyone remembers from this film, Candle on the Water. There's Room for Everyone, probably one of my favorite Disney villain songs, Every Little Piece, Brazzle Dazzle Day, and of course another good villain song, Bill of Sale. But anyway, back to the synopsis. They barely manage to escape the Gogans, and the next day they end up in a town called Passamaquoddy, which is a coastal town where they have a lot of fishing, is one of their, apparently their main trades, at least one of the ones we see, and they have a lighthouse. And the lighthouse is run by a man named Lampy, who apparently is an alcoholic, even though they don't state it, but you can tell by how he acts, he's an alcoholic. And his daughter Nora, played, of course, Lampy is Mickey Rooney, and his daughter Nora is Helen Reddy. Now, of course, when they show up, Elliott's invisible, and because of this, causes a little bit of trouble, and they think it's Pete causing it. So he has to hide a little bit, and of course there's a little thing that runs into the I Saw a Dragon song. I'm not going to spoil, but it is a little bit of a funny thing. Pete eventually makes his way to the lighthouse and meets Nora. She takes him in. Lampy, of course, at first is like, okay. He's like, that's the boy with the dragon. But then he decides to relent and let him stay. And the next morning, we're introduced to the main antagonist of the movie. We don't know he's the main antagonist until later, but I'm just going to let you know. Doc Terminus, who is, he's basically a charlatan type medicine man, uses fake medicines and stuff and then runs when he's discovered. I mean, when we first see him and his assistant Hoagie, played by Red Buttons, are running from one. Are they still after us? We've lost them! And of course, with their number and stuff, you can tell they've been in Passamaquoddy before. It's been a while, but the people remember them, so they have to do a little song and dance number in order to get the people to trust them again, which they do. And of course, you can tell they're going to drain the town dry and then leave. Now, eventually, Doc Terminus, thanks to Hoagie and a drunk Lampy, Terminus and Hoagie find out about Elliott, and of course they scheme to do it, and this leads into the climax, including a little deal with the Gogans after their old musical number, and that's basically the plot involved. And the ending of the plot is basically trying to get Elliott and make a profit on him, which you wouldn't really expect a capitalistic type scenario to end up in a Disney movie as one of the villain's main reasons for their goal, especially during the Cold War. I know I'm probably just one of the few people seeing this, but it's there. It's interesting, but it's not something you don't expect. But I actually liked it. It's there that he's a greedy villain, and I know most villains are greedy, but the way he's going about it with his wording and stuff, it makes me think of capitalism. I wonder if like I said, I wonder if I'm the only one seeing that or not, but probably just me. But anyway, acting, Sean Marshall, this was the first film he did. Now, this was his first movie role, at least it was released. Apparently he did something called The Deadly Trackers, but I don't think he really was a big role in that. And based on what it said, he only has a small filmography. This is probably his biggest film of note, because not that few years after this film, he left the industry and basically went into the United States Merchant Marine Academy and got a BS in Marine Transportation. And he lives in New Mexico now. Helen Reddy, you know, I know her more slightly for singing, and of course that little cameo in Blue Harvest. Helen Reddy standing by, but I have to say, in this film, she actually did a pretty good job. I'm checking to see if she was in the other film, because now I think I'm checking Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Love Boat, Fantasy Island. If I'm reading this right, it looks like she mostly did TV stuff, but I think she did a pretty good job as Nora in this movie. Nothing award-winning, I would say, but a very good job. And she shines most. I'd say that one of the scenes she shines the most in is probably the Candle in the Water number. But then again, she's a singer, so for a musical, you'd probably want at least a few actresses that can actually sing, because that's the one thing I hate when they do musical movies, is if you get actresses and actors that can't sing to save their life. I mean, it's one thing when they're doing the animated ones where they can get one to do the normal voice and one to do the singing voice, but for a live action one, can't really cut it that way. Mickey Rooney, like I mentioned, is Lampy. He's great in this movie. He really does play a convincing drunk in the scene. He's supposed to be intoxicated. In scenes where he's not, he's good as well. And I've never actually heard him sing in anything else, but he does a pretty good job with the singing ones. I know he had a big career before this, and he's done like a lot of stuff afterwards. This is probably the one I know him mostly from. Other than this, of course, I know him from Phantom of the Megaplex, that Disney TV movie, and of course his minor role in Night at the Museum, which I thought he was very hilarious in there. But I'll talk about that when I get to that review one day. And of course, other things like the Care Bears movie, among other stuff. But I thought he was pretty good in it. Jim Dale is Dr. Terminus. Excellent role, and like I mentioned, he has one of my favorite Disney villain songs, and he is slightly over the top at times, but for a movie aimed at families, and the fact that he's kind of greedy, and the fact that it's a Disney movie, it's kind of forgivable, because it's that over-the-top type of thing you would expect from a family-type movie, and it's only for a little bit. It's not like his whole performance. Like, he's serious at times, but you can tell when he loses his temper a little bit that he gets that way. Rudd Buttons as Hoagie is more over the top, but that's because he's kind of like a cowardly sidekick character, and it's mostly through his screaming. He doesn't get annoying like, say, someone like Rob Schneider would, but you could tell that it's just fun to watch. And he's not really as evil as Terminus is, Hoagie. He's more of a basically just following his boss, and you can tell he has a good heart. I mean, even Elliott could see this, and he doesn't want to hurt him at times, but you can tell that. Shelley Winters as Lena Gogan, you just want to smack her. And Shelley Winters, she's always good usually whenever she's in, and here she did a pretty good job. And her I don't know if she sang much in other movies, but she sings pretty good in the two numbers she gets. And of course, Charles Tyner as her husband does a pretty good job. Gary Morgan and Jeff Conaway as their kids do a pretty good job as well. Even though he's only in one scene, Cal Bartlett as Paul, Nora's fiance, also does a good job. And then of course, Jim Backus of Gilligan's Island fame is also in this movie as the mayor of Passamaquoddy, and he's always good to see too. Now, according to Wikipedia, the film had a budget of about $10 million, which I can more or less see that, because for a film in the 70s, $10 million was a reasonable sized budget. It'd be a small budget comparatively today, but it was about, I'd say probably, I don't know what the comparison would be. I think it'd probably be like a $20, $30 million budget today, maybe a little bit more. So it was a pretty good sized budget, and you could see watching it where the money went. Some of it, probably like a portion of it went to the main stars' pockets, of course, because these were big stars back then. They're still big today, but not as big. But I have a feeling a good portion, that about at least 60% of it is on screen, maybe 70% of it. And you can really really see it there, especially like during some of the musical numbers, like the I Saw a Dragon sequence really shows off the film's budget and stuff, and of course also how they fleshed in the character of Elliott into the movie. Like one scene in particular at the end where they have the net over him, how they did that. That was beautiful. I don't think it would have been executed as well today. Well, maybe it might have, but only if it's done with people who prefer practical whenever possible. But that's starting to become a dying field, I think. And of course, it made $36 million, so it was a hit, but it could have been a bigger hit. I mean, it wasn't as big as, let's say, Mary Poppins or Bedknobs and Broomsticks, but then again, I think it was probably because Disney might have been hoping it would have been, but it was at least still a minor hit. And it got a couple Academy Award nominations. It was nominated for Best Original Song for Candle in the Water and Best Original Score, which I will say it deserved both of them, because the score and the music in this movie, magnificent. And I have to say, if there would be any Disney movie I think they could turn into a musical in the same vein that they've done with Beauty and the Beast, I think it would be this one. The only hard part I could figure is trying to incorporate Elliott into it. Well, the easy thing would probably be just go the whole Tinkerbell route, like in the Peter Pan play. Just have it be like a flashlight thing, or like have a guy in costume who just appears randomly whenever Elliott's supposed to be visible. You'd have to figure out a way to do it, but it'd be interesting to see how they would translate it. But maybe that's just alas, that's just my dream. Now, in conclusion, it's an entertaining Disney movie. Still holds up today with me. Is it as good? Like I said, not as good as something like Bedknobs and Broomsticks or Mary Poppins, but could you really expect it to be as good as them? And like I said, Don Chaffey does a great job with the direction. The actors are believable and excellent. Score very well done. How the camera work I thought was pretty good. How they integrate Elliott into the actual live action sequences was good. And I think it's a film that any fan of Disney films should give a watch. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's YouTubed in parts, so just type in Pete's Dragon and see if it still is. I know individual scenes are, and I know the soundtrack is.